The night Shagrol Darkwolf bared her tusks at Jeremiah Hayes's door was the same night the wolves came down from the Greymont Ridge. And he thought, standing in the doorway with a lantern trembling in his fist, that she was the most terrifying and magnificent thing he had ever seen in all his 31 years of living on the frontier edge of the world. She stood in the snow. That was the first thing that struck him as wrong, as out of place in a way he could not immediately name. She stood in the snow with her boots soaked through and her dark leather coat hanging off one shoulder, the lacing torn loose at the collar. She was tall, taller than him by a full hand's length, with the broad shoulders of someone who had carried heavy things all her life. Her skin was a deep gray-green in the lantern light, her jaw strong and squared, and the tusks that curved up from her lower lip were bared not in aggression, he would come to understand, but in warning. A warning aimed past him into the dark trees at his back, where the wolves circled and called to one another in the cold throat of the night. "Get inside," she said. Her voice was low, roughened by the wind. Now, Jeremiah Hayes did not move. He was not a cowardly man, but he was a careful one, shaped by years alone on this homestead with nothing but his own judgment between him and ruin. He looked at the orc woman on his porch, and he looked at the darkness past her shoulder, and he heard the wolves call again, closer. And he stepped back from the doorway and held the lantern high and said, "Come in then." She came in. She had to duck slightly under the frame, and she brought the cold with her the way a storm brings rain, all at once, unavoidably, filling the room with something that was larger than the space it occupied. She stood in the middle of his main room, dripping snowmelt onto the stone floor, and her yellow-green eyes moved over everything. The hearth, the iron hooks on the wall, the table with his half-eaten supper still on it, the narrow stairway leading up to his sleeping loft, taking inventory, identifying exits and threats. Jeremiah shut the door and set the lantern on the mantel and crossed to stoke the fire without saying anything. He added 2 logs and waited until the flames caught before he turned around. "You're injured," he said. She looked at him flatly. "It is nothing. Your shoulder is not nothing." He could see the dark stain at her collar now, where the leather had separated from the linen underneath. A wound several hours old by the color of it. "Sit down before you fall down." Something moved through her expression then. Not anger, he had braced himself for anger, for the defensiveness that pain produced in proud people, and she was clearly proud. What moved through her expression instead was something more complicated, something that looked almost like surprise, as if she had not expected to be spoken to directly, plainly, without performance. She sat down in the wooden chair nearest the hearth. The chair was not built for someone her size, but it held. Jeremiah went to his supply chest and found the linen and the pot of pine resin salve his neighbor Merritt had given him the previous autumn. He brought them to the table and he said, "May I?" She looked at the linen in his hand. She looked at him. "My name is Jeremiah Hayes," he said. "This is my homestead. I've been farming this land for 6 years. I'm not going to hurt you." A long pause. Outside, the wind moved through the pines and the wolves called again, farther now, retreating. "Shagrol," she said at last. "Shagrol Darkwolf. Shagrol." He said it the way she had said it, not pulling the sounds apart into something easier for a human tongue, just trying to honor them. "All right." "May I see the shoulder?" She pulled the torn collar aside herself, and what he saw there made him breathe carefully through his nose. A cut deep enough to need proper closure, ragged at the edges like something had caught her and then torn free. He did not ask what had caused it. Not yet. He cleaned it with water he heated over the fire. He pressed linen against it when it wept and he held it there with steady hands. She did not make a sound. Not once. She sat in the firelight and she was entirely still, her jaw set, her eyes fixed on some point across the room, and he could feel the tension in her the way you feel a bowstring drawn back, absolute and tremendous and full of controlled force. "You're going to want this closed properly," he said. "I can do it if you'll allow it. I've stitched worse on myself." "You are a farmer," she said. "A farmer who lives 40 miles from any settlement." Yes, he met her eyes. "I've had to learn things." Another pause. "Then do it." He stitched the wound with the small curved needle he kept in his kit, and the waxed thread that he used for leather and sail canvas. She bore it without any sound at all. When he was done, he applied the pine resin salve and bound the shoulder with clean linen and sat back on his heels. "How did you come to be out in that storm?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that he thought she was not going to answer. Then she said, "I was passing through the valley. I do not have a place to winter." She said it plainly, without apology, the way someone states a fact they have long since stopped being ashamed of. A band of men from the Crossford settlement came out of the tree line. They had dogs and torches. They did not want me in the valley. Jeremiah was quiet. "One of them had a blade," she said. "He caught my shoulder before I could clear the trees." He looked down at the basin of water in his hands, now pink with her blood, and he was quiet for another moment, and then he said, "You can stay here for the winter if you need." She stared at him. "I have a second room," he said, because her silence seemed to require explanation. "A storage room on the east side. It is not fine, but it is warm and dry, and it has a door that locks. There is a cot in there. Some of my late wife's things are in there still, but they don't take up much room. I would need help come spring. There is a north field I have not been able to break alone. If you are willing to work, we could call it a fair exchange." He said it all practically, matter-of-factly, as if housing an orc woman through a frontier winter was a reasonable arrangement a person might simply propose. He kept his eyes steady on her face. Shagrol Darkwolf looked at this human man in his rough woven shirt, sitting on the floor of his own home with a basin of her blood in his hands, and she said nothing for a very long time. And then she said, "Why?" "Because you're hurt and it is cold and you bared your tusks at my door," he said simply. "That means you're mine to protect, or at least it does where I come from." She blinked. It was the first time he had seen her expression shift past careful blankness, and what replaced it was something raw and unguarded, something that came and went so quickly he could not fully name it. It looked like it might have been the particular ache of someone who had not been spoken to kindly in a very long time. "Where did you learn that?" she asked. "My father traded at the Denmark orc camps when I was young. I went with him sometimes." He rose and took the basin to the hearth to dispose of. "He said that when an orc bares their tusks at you without advancing, they're marking you as someone under their watch, someone they've chosen to shield." He glanced back at her. "I always thought it was a fine custom." Shagrol Darkwolf sat in the firelight of a human farmer's home and felt something shift inside the armored country of herself, slow and tectonic, like a stone wall receiving the first crack of spring thaw. She had not asked for it. She had not looked for it, but there it was. "I will take the room," she said at last. "Good," said Jeremiah Hayes, and he went to put more water on for tea. The room he gave her was small and smelled of dried lavender and cedar, which meant it had belonged to a woman who had cared about such things. There was a cot with a wool blanket and a wooden chest, and a single window that looked east toward the Greymount. Shagrol set her pack against the wall and sat on the edge of the cot, and listened to the storm press against the shutters and thought about how strange it was to feel the specific weight of warmth, the specific texture of shelter, after so many weeks without it. She had been 3 months on the road. She had left the Darkwolf clan camp in the high hills to the north, when the war between the Darkwolf and Stonehorn clans finally consumed everything it had been consuming slowly for years. Her mother was dead. Her older brother Varg was dead. She had buried what she could of them in the rocky ground of the high hills, and she had walked south with her pack and her belt knife, and the iron certainty that she would not grieve in front of anyone who might use it against her. She had not anticipated the cold. She had underestimated the lowland winter, which was different from the high country winter she knew, wetter, grayer, more relentless in its damp grip. She had not anticipated the reception in the valley settlements, either, although she supposed she should have. She knew what lowland humans thought of orc people. She had known since she was 8 years old, and a farmer's wife in Denmark had pulled her children behind her skirts at the sight of young Shagrol at the market stall. Jeremiah Hayes was, in her experience of the world, something of an anomaly. She lay down on the cot and pulled the wool blanket over her injured shoulder, and she let herself sleep. She had not slept properly in 4 nights. In the morning the storm had passed, and the world outside the east window was white and blue and achingly clear. Shagrol heard sounds from the main room before she was fully awake: a cast iron pan on the hearth, the groan of wood settling in the cold, the quiet, efficient movement of someone who lived alone and had learned to take up exactly as much space as they needed and no more. She rose. She washed her face with water from the basin by the door. She looked in the small, polished piece of tin that served as a mirror, her reflection dim and greenish, her thick dark hair loose from its braid, her eyes deep-set and pale yellow-green, her tusks gleaming against her lower lip. She looked, she thought, like what she was, an orc woman on the far end of a hard season, with a bandaged shoulder and no particular claim on anything in the world except her own 2 hands and the life she had managed so far to survive. She rebraided her hair. She went out. Jeremiah was at the hearth making porridge. He looked up when she came in, the way you look up at someone you were already aware of, not startled, just acknowledging. He had the kind of face that Shagrol had learned to read as honest, though she was still being careful with that reading. Weathered, lean, with dark eyes that did not skitter away from direct contact the way so many human eyes did when faced with an orc. His jaw was shadowed with several days of dark beard, his hair needed cutting, and he had the hands of someone who worked hard in soil, wide-knuckled, permanently stained around the nail beds in a way no amount of washing would undo. "How is the shoulder?" he asked. "Stiff," she said. "Better than it was. Sit. There is porridge and there is salt pork if you want it." She sat. She ate. It was the first proper meal she had eaten in days, and she was careful not to eat too fast, though the hunger in her was considerable. Jeremiah ate across from her without making any comment on how much food she took, which she appreciated more than she would have admitted. After breakfast, he took her on a brief survey of the homestead in the cold morning light. It was a working farm, well tended and sensibly laid out, a main house of squared logs with a stone foundation, a barn for 2 horses and 6 goats, a root cellar built into the hillside, a woodshed stacked high with quartered pine, and beyond all of it the fields. The south field and the east meadow, which had been cleared and planted the last several seasons, and the north field, which was still rough ground, full of stumps and rocks and the matted root systems of trees that had been felled the previous spring. "That is the work for this coming season," he said, nodding at the north field. "Breaking it properly so it can be planted by late spring. It wants 2 people or 1 person with a team of oxen, and I've only the horses." "I can break ground," said Shagrol. "I know," said Jeremiah Hayes, and there was something in his voice that was not condescension. It was simply acknowledgement, the same way he acknowledged the field itself, as something capable and real. "I am not in the habit of underestimating what a person can do." She looked at him for a moment. He was looking at the field, calculating, already somewhere in the plans he made in his head. She looked at the field too. "We will need the right tools," she said. "I have axes and mattocks. The grubbing hoe wants a new handle. I can make one this week." "I will help," she said, "with the handle." He glanced at her sideways. "You know woodwork." "I know how to make tools last," she said. "My mother taught me." She said it simply, and she moved on from it without making it into anything more. The weeks of deepest winter settled around the homestead like a held breath. The snow came and stayed, and the cold had a quality to it that Shagrol recognized as the kind that kills if you are not careful. She and Jeremiah developed the routines of the house quickly and almost without discussion, the way people do when they are both practical and the situation demands it. She took the morning milking of the goats because she woke earliest. He took the late evening fire banking because he stayed up later. She mended a section of fence that the weight of snow had broken. He repaired the hinge on the root cellar door that had been rusting loose. They ate together at the table, twice a day, and the conversations they had were careful at first, measured, like 2 people learning the particular weight of each word before placing it down. She learned that his wife had been a woman named Clara, who had died of a fever 2 winters previous. He said it without excessive grief, but the grief was there in the way he said her name contained, permanent, lived with. He had come to this land from the eastern provinces as a younger man, 23 years old, with Clara and a deed, and the belief that the frontier could be shaped into something lasting if you were willing to work hard enough. He had been right, and wrong, and right again. She learned that he had a sister in Crossford, the same settlement whose men had driven Shagrol into the storm. He did not shy from that fact when she told him the fuller version of what had happened. He looked at the table for a moment and then he said, "My sister is not those men, but I understand why it would not feel that way." He paused. "I am sorry they hurt you." She did not know what to do with the apology, and so she said nothing, which he seemed to understand. He learned slowly the shape of what she carried, that she had come from a warrior clan but had never been drawn to warfare as a thing in itself, that her skill was in tracking and reading landscape, in knowing the land the way a hunter knows it, all the invisible lines of it, where the water moves under the surface, where the game sleeps and feeds, where the safe paths run. That she had wanted to be a herbalist, a thing her clan had not understood, her mother aside. Her mother had understood most things. He learned that she was 28 years old, that she had dark humor when she trusted the listener enough to deploy it, that she was meticulous about the care of tools, that she ran her fingers along the spines of his books when she thought he was not looking, lingering, wanting. "Can you read?" he asked one evening, catching her at it. She pulled her hand back. "A little, enough." "Which language?" "Orcish script, some common tongue." She lifted her chin slightly. "My mother taught me both." She believed it mattered to be able to read the same words as the people who would write laws against you. There was a silence, and then Jeremiah rose and took the book from the shelf and put it in her hands. It was a survey of local plants and their uses, written by a naturalist who had traveled this region 20 years prior. "You should have this," he said. "I can't make use of half of it." She looked at him. Then she looked at the book. She turned it over in her big hand slowly, carefully, the way you handle something you are not certain you are allowed to have. "I would like to borrow it," she said. He sat back down. "Keep it as long as you need." She did not say thank you out loud, but she opened the book to the first page with the particular reverence of someone who has not often been given things, and that was enough. The turning of the season arrived the way it always does in the high country, not all at once but in increments, the kind you only notice when you compare one week to the next. The days lengthened by slow degrees. The snow retreated from the south-facing slopes first, revealing the dark earth beneath, cold and rich and waiting. The goats grew restless in the barn. The horses threw their heads and stamped when you brought them out for water, feeling the change in the air. Shagrol's shoulder healed cleanly. She moved without restriction by midwinter, and she put the strength of her recovery into the work of the homestead without being asked. She split wood. She tracked the deer that had been pressing in toward the barn and drove them back. She sat evenings with her belt knife and the handles of the tools that wanted attention, reshaping and sanding and rubbing them with tallow until the wood was right. She was not performing industry. She was simply someone who did not know how to be idle in a place that needed work done. Jeremiah watched her without letting her see him watching. He was a man who had learned patience in all things, who had learned that the most important kind of looking is the kind done quietly, over time, without demand. He was also a man who had loved his wife sincerely and buried her honestly, and who had lived 2 years alone in the clean austerity of that solitude, and who now found himself aware of another person in his house in a way that was different from awareness of a boarder or a laborer. He noticed that when she laughed, when he managed to coax it out of her, which became a private and significant goal, it was a low, unguarded sound, like something she did not deploy strategically. He noticed that she had a habit of pressing her thumb along the edge of any smooth stone she found, testing its quality. He noticed that she watched the Greymont Ridge from the east window most mornings, not with any particular expression, just watching, the way you watch a place that has been part of you. "Do you miss the mountains?" he asked her one morning. "I miss the elevation," she said. "The way you can see for a long distance, Down here the trees are always in the way. There's a ridge on the east property line, he said. You can see 20 miles on a clear day. I go up sometimes when I need it. She looked at him, assessing what that offer was, whether it was an invitation. He looked back at her with the steady directness she had come to recognize as simply his manner, not aggression, not performance, just presence. "Show me," she said. They went up the ridge the following morning when the first clear day in a week arrived. The climb was steep enough to require attention, through pine and bare-branched oak, the ground still frozen under the leaf litter, the air sharp and clean in a way that Shagrol felt in her chest like a sudden freedom. At the top, the ridge broke open on a stone shelf, and the view spread east and north in a great sweep of white and gray, and the distant blue suggestion of real mountains, the peaks of the Greymount catching the morning light. She stood at the edge of the shelf and she looked, and for a long moment she was completely still, her face open in a way it rarely was, her eyes moving across the distance with something that might have been grief and might have been relief and might have been both. "Your people," he said, not a question. "The high country. I was born up there," she said, "in a summer camp at 7,000 feet. My mother said the goats could barely breathe and she was not sure the baby would either, but I came out roaring." She paused. Her words, he smiled. It was a quiet smile aimed at the view. "What was she like?" he asked. Shagrol was quiet for a moment and then she said, "She was the most capable person I have ever known. She could read a weather pattern 3 days out and she was never wrong about it. She knew every medicinal plant in the high country. She fought when she had to and made peace when she could, and she believed that those two things were not contradictions." She paused again. "She deserved more years than she got. I think that about Clara sometimes," he said. "She deserved more years." They stood together on the ridge in the cold morning air, two people who had both put something precious into the ground, and neither of them tried to make that shared weight into something easier than it was. After a while she sat down on a flat stone and he sat down beside her, not touching, just close, and they were quiet together for a long time, and the silence between them was not empty. They came back to the homestead by late morning and ate midday together, and the quality of the air between them had shifted slightly, the way it does when two people have been honest with each other about something real. Spring arrived and the work of the North Field began. It was brutal work, the kind that leaves you aching from your teeth to your heels by end of day. The stumps were the worst of it, oak roots that went deep and sideways in every direction, requiring the grubbing hoe and the mattock, and sometimes the chain hitched to the horses to drag the root mass free. Shagrol swung the felling axe with a power and precision that Jeremiah watched with frank appreciation. She worked with a focused economy of motion, never wasting effort, reading the grain of the wood instinctively before she struck so that each blow went where it needed to go. He was no less capable, though in a different way. He was methodical, tireless in a slower way, able to sustain a steady effort over the long hours of the day without flagging, and he understood the puzzle of the land, where the rocks lay hidden, which direction the drainage ran, where to place the rows when the ground was finally open. They worked side by side from first light until the light went. At midday they sat together on the cold ground with bread and dried meat and drank from the creek and talked about the field, about what it was becoming, about what they would plant in it. She knew more about soil than he did. He knew more about which crops the market at Denmark wanted. They debated the North Row. She wanted medicinal herbs, a kitchen garden border of lavender and yarrow and valerian. He wanted a full row of oats for the animals. In the end they split it, and she was satisfied and so was he. It was on one of those midday rests, in the 3rd week of the North Field work, with both of them dirty and sweat-damp and tired in the good way of useful labor, that she told him the fuller story of the Darkwolf clan and the war, and what it had cost her. She told it without decoration. In the plain, honest way she told most things, looking at the field rather than at him. She told him about her mother's death and her brother's death, and the morning she had walked away from the high country with her pack and her grief, and the belief that the world did not particularly accommodate mourning orc women, and so she had better simply move. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "I'm glad you came to this door." She looked at him. "I mean it," he said. "Not for what I can get from it, just I'm glad you're here. You should be somewhere, and I'm glad it was here." She held his gaze for a moment, and what she felt was something she did not have immediate words for, something that pressed outward from the inside of her chest in a way that was a little frightening because it was a little like hope, and hope in Shagrol Darkwolf's experience had historically been something that the world took back. "Do not make me regret feeling comfortable," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. "I won't," he said. And he said it with such uncomplicated certainty that she believed him. The north field was broken and harrowed by early summer. On the day they finished, Jeremiah stood at the edge of the turned earth and looked at what they had made together and said, quietly, "Thank you." She stood beside him and said nothing, but she stood close enough that their arms nearly touched, and she did not move away. Summer moved through the homestead in long golden rhythms. The crops came in strong, the south field of winter wheat and barley, the east meadow where the kitchen garden grew, and now the north field with its new rows of oats and the border of medicinal herbs that Shagrol tended with a careful, expert attention that surprised him daily. She had knowledge that was vast and practical and specific. She knew which plants supported which other plants, which needed the drier soil at the field's upper edge, and which wanted the dampness at the low end, when to harvest, and when to leave a thing to continue growing. She began making preparations, dried bunches hanging from the ceiling beams of the storage room, infusions and tinctures in the small jars he brought from the Denmark market. She developed a simple reference system in the margins of his plant survey book, adding her own notes in the cramped, careful letters of someone who writes slowly and precisely because the words matter. Neighbors came in the summer. Merritt from the East Farm, a square-bodied woman of 50 who arrived with a wheel of cheese and looked at Shagrol with transparent wariness for the first 10 minutes of her visit, and then became entirely absorbed in asking her questions about the yarrow, and whether it was the three-leafed variety because her goats had been limping, and she had heard yarrow poultice helped. Shagrol answered her directly, and Merritt left with a bundle of dried yarrow and what appeared to be a nascent respect. A trader named Paul came through with his wagon in midsummer, headed for Denmark with goods from the eastern provinces, and stayed a night. He was polite in the careful way of a man who had learned that frontier communities had their own rules and you did not always know what they were. He slept in the barn, and in the morning he bought 3 small jars of Shagrol's calendula salve, the kind you put on rope burns and tool cuts, and paid fairly for them. It was Paul, as he was hitching his horses, who said to Jeremiah, not unkindly, with the curiosity of a man who simply wondered about things, "Is she your wife?" "She is my partner in this farm," said Jeremiah, and it was not exactly an answer, and it was not exactly not an answer, and Paul, who was perceptive, nodded and said no more about it. The question stayed with Jeremiah through the rest of that day and into the night. He sat on the porch after supper as he sometimes did, watching the sky deepen over the Greymount, and he turned the question over and looked at it honestly. The honest looking was something he had always been able to do, even when what he found was inconvenient. What he found was that he had been watching Shagrol Darkwolf for months with the particular quality of attention that you give to things you value, and that the value had changed from the value of a capable partner in difficult work to something more than that, something he did not have a clean word for but which lived in his chest like a warm, persistent pressure. Something that made him aware of her in a room the way you are aware of fire. He also found that he had not the faintest idea what she felt, because she was private in the way that people are private when they have learned that their interior life is not safe to display, and he was not willing to presume. He sat with it. What he did not realize was that Shagrol was sitting with something too, on the other side of the wall, in the room that was hers now in a way she had not expected, in the way that a place becomes yours not by deed, but by the accumulation of mornings and evenings and the small familiar details of daily life. She sat on her cot and braided her hair for the night and turned over the strange territory of what she had been feeling for weeks with the same careful, methodical attention she gave to everything that mattered. She had not come to this homestead looking for anything except survival. She had been done with looking for things, she had thought. The high country had taken everything she had loved and she had walked away from the ruins of it, and she had not intended to build anything new on ground that could be taken from her again. But here was the thing that made her press her thumb along the smooth edge of a stone and stare at the east window in the early morning. Here was the inconvenient, astonishing thing. Jeremiah Hayes had not asked her to build anything. He had simply built himself, steadily and genuinely, being what he was in the plain daily light of working and eating and listening and making things. And she had found herself, without planning it, without deciding, already inside something she had thought she was not capable of anymore. She was careful. She continued being careful, but she stopped being quite so armored about it, the way you stop holding a shield up when the danger has not materialized for long enough that your arms get tired. It was high summer when the thing happened that could have ended it. A group of men came from Crossford. 3 of them mounted, and one of them was the man who had put the blade to her shoulder in the snowstorm. She recognized him from his horse, a roan gelding with a cropped tail, and from the way he sat in the saddle with the particular confidence of someone who is accustomed to not facing consequences. His name was Aldous Birch, and he was the son of the man who ran the Crossford trading post and believed that the frontier valley was his family's territory by right of commerce and disposition. He had heard from Paul that the Hayes farm had an orc woman wintering and now summering on the property. He had opinions about that. They rode into the farmyard at mid-morning. Jeremiah came out of the barn where he had been mending a harness. Shagrol came out of the north field with the mattock still in her hand. She stopped when she saw the roan gelding. Something in her face went very still. Aldous Birch looked at Shagrol with the expression of a man who expects his existence to be a sufficient argument. He then looked at Jeremiah with the expression of a man who expects other men to understand the hierarchy without it needing to be explained. "Hayes," he said, "this needs sorting." "Good morning," said Jeremiah. He wiped his hands on his work trousers. His voice was entirely level. "That orc needs to move on. The valley folk have agreed on it. She caused trouble in the settlements this past winter." "She was attacked in the settlements this past winter," said Jeremiah. "By you," Aldous blinked. He had apparently not expected that. "She was trespassing. She was walking through a valley," said Jeremiah. "There is no law against it." Shagrol stood where she was. She did not advance. She was not going to fight these men if she could help it, not here, not on Jeremiah's land. But she held the mattock without any performance of harmlessness, just held it, and her tusks were slightly raised. "Hayes, you're running a risk-keeping company like this." "You rode onto my property uninvited," said Jeremiah, and now his voice had a quality that was different from its usual steadiness. It was still quiet, but it had something in it that was like the moment before a storm breaks, like pressure. "You have said what you came to say. Now I am asking you to leave. If you come back here with intent to do harm to anyone on this farm, I will take the matter to the valley magistrate at Dunmark. I know him personally. I know what the laws say about assault on a public road and about trespass on private land." Aldous Birch sat on his roan gelding and looked at Jeremiah Hayes with the slow recalculation of a man who had expected capitulation and found instead something that did not move. "You're making an enemy," Aldous said. "I hope not," said Jeremiah. "I'd prefer a neighbor, but that's your choice to make, not mine." A long pause. Then Aldous turned his horse and his 2 companions followed, and they rode back out of the farmyard and down the track toward the valley road. Shagrol watched the roan gelding until it disappeared between the trees. Then she let out a breath that was very slow. Jeremiah came to stand beside her. He did not say anything immediately. He looked at the place where the riders had gone, and then he said, "Are you all right?" Yes, she looked at him, the full force of him, standing there in his work clothes with the morning sun on his face, having said those things to those men without flinching, without performing it, just simply meaning them. Jeremiah. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. 2 words, and in her mouth they carried the weight of something that had no other form. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said quietly, "You don't have to thank me for that." "I know," she said. "I still mean it." They stood in the farmyard together for another moment, and then they went back to work, because there was work to be done, and because they were both people who handled the large emotional facts of life by continuing to move through the material world that required their attention. But something had shifted, irrevocably, in the space between them. Late summer, and the harvest beginning. The barley came first, then the wheat, and the work was long and continuous and sweet in its own way. The particular satisfaction of cutting what you have grown, the smell of the cut grain in the morning sun, the rhythmic labor of the sickle and the cradle, and the long days of stooking and carting. They worked from before dawn until after dark during the worst of it, and at the end of those days they sat at the table and ate without much conversation, too tired for words, and it was in those silences that Shagrol noticed, with the tracking instinct of a woman who read landscape, that something in Jeremiah Hayes was different when he looked at her now. She did not immediately do anything with that noticing. She kept her own counsel, as she always did, but she felt it. The medicinal herbs came off in waves through the latter part of summer, the lavender first, then the valerian and the yarrow, then the late calendula. She dried and bundled and jarred with focused attention. She had more than she had expected. The soil in the Northfield border had suited the plants. She was looking at a real supply. "I want to take these to market at Denmark," she said one evening with the jars and the bundles spread across the table between them. "Not to a trader intermediary, directly. If the stall fee is what I think and if the prices hold, there's a proper income here." Jeremiah looked at the inventory. He looked at her. "You've thought it through." "I have been thinking it through since mid-spring," she said. "Lavender oil, calendula salve, yarrow tincture. Valerian root preparation. There's a gap in what the Denmark apothecary carries, and I have spoken to Merritt and she says the same." "Merritt talks to you now," he observed. "Merritt talks to everyone," said Shagrol. "She only needed a reason to talk to me." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the layout on the table. Then he said, "The Denmark market is not always welcoming to orc traders. I want to be honest with you about that." "I know," she said. "I have thought about that too." She met his eyes. "I would want you to come with me. The first time at least, until I know the lay of it." There was something in that, in being asked, in being needed in that specific way, that moved through him like warmth. "Of course," he said. "We would go together," she said. "As partners." "As partners," he agreed. They went to Denmark in early autumn with the wagon loaded with Shagrol's preparations and a season's worth of grain for the mill. The town was 3 days' drive, and they camped the first and second nights beside the road under a shared canvas against the autumn rain. And those nights, the fire between them, the sound of rain on the canvas, the particular contained quality of 2 people sharing shelter in the outdoors, had a different texture than the house, more immediate, more honest. The first night she asked him about Clara, what she had been like. He talked about her for a while in the firelight, honestly and with love, and then he was quiet, and Shagrol said, "She was lucky to have someone who speaks of her like that." "I was lucky to have her to speak of," he said. "Do you still grieve her?" Asked not intrusively, just wanting the true shape of the thing. He considered. "Yes, not the way I did, not the way that makes it hard to breathe. The way it is now is more like I carry her. She is part of how I understand what love is, what it can be." He looked at the fire. "I think grief like that is not supposed to go away. I think it becomes something else, something you build with." She was quiet for a while, then she said, "I have not let myself build with it yet, the grief I carry." She said it with some difficulty, as if the words required effort to bring out. "I have been afraid of what I would find underneath it." "What do you think you would find?" She looked at the fire too. The desire to begin again, she said, which is terrifying when you have already lost so much. He looked at her then, and she felt the weight of that look, the full, particular attention of it, and she turned her head and met his eyes across the fire. They looked at each other for a long moment. The fire spoke between them, and the rain came down on the canvas, and it was as honest and unguarded as either of them had been. "I understand that," he said quietly. "I know you do," she said. "That is why I said it." They reached Denmark on the third morning and drove the wagon through the town gates into the market district. Denmark was a working town of several thousand, large by frontier standards, with a proper grid of muddy streets and timber-framed buildings, and a market square that ran 3 days a week. It had a significant orc quarter on the south side of town, where orc traders and craftspeople had established themselves over several decades, and a human majority in the northern districts, and the two communities coexisted with the particular watchful pragmatism of people who had learned that commerce required tolerance of a functional, if not always emotional, variety. There was still friction. They felt it when they drove the wagon into the market square, the way certain eyes tracked their paired presence, a human man and an orc woman on the same wagon bench, sitting close enough that their shoulders occasionally touched with the movement of the road. Eyes that were calculating, skeptical, waiting to categorize. Jeremiah drove the wagon without any indication that he noticed the looks. He helped her unload the jars and bundles onto their rented table without performance, without the self-consciousness of a man doing something he thought might be judged. He simply did it. The first hour was slow. People approached the table and then looked at Shagrol and reconsidered and moved on. A few stayed, a woman looking specifically for valerian who had run out of her own supply, a leatherworker whose hands were cracked, and Raw who bought 2 jars of calendula salve on the recommendation of his neighbor standing beside him, a child who asked about the lavender bundles with bright-eyed directness, and received a small one as a gift because Shagrol, whatever else she was gentle with children. By midday the table was attracting more attention. The quality of the preparations was evident. The oils were clear and fragrant, the salves smooth-textured, the dried bundles properly dried and tied. By late afternoon she had sold half her stock. By the end of market day, 3/4. Walking back to the wagon with the coin purse in her hand, Shagrol Darkwolf stopped in the middle of the Denmark market square and looked at the purse, and then at the emptied table, and then at Jeremiah, who was loading the remaining jars with the careful steadiness he gave everything. She had built something. She had brought it to a place and offered it, and it had been wanted. It was such a small thing in the face of everything that had been taken from her, and it was such a vast thing in the same moment. Jeremiah looked up and saw her face. "Come here," he said simply. She went to him. He took the coin purse out of her hand and put it in the wagon box, and then he took her hand, the large, strong-boned hand of a woman who had worked all her life, in both of his, and he held it. "You built that," he said, "from that north field, from nothing." She looked at their joined hands, then she looked at him. And what she felt was so large and so warm and so impossible to contain that she put her forehead down to his shoulder for a moment, just a moment, and he put his free hand on the back of her head, and they stood like that in the Denmark market square while the last of the afternoon traders packed up around them. No one bothered them. A few people looked. Most looked away. When she lifted her head, his expression was very quiet, very full, and she thought she had never in her life been looked at by someone the way he looked at her. "Jeremiah," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think I am going to need you to say something clear and honest," she said, "because I cannot afford to read it wrong, and I am not entirely sure I trust my own reading right now." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I love you. That is the honest and clear thing. I have been loving you since somewhere around midwinter, and I have been trying not to be foolish about it, and I may not have succeeded entirely." He held her hand more firmly. "You do not have to feel the same. I will not make it into something that changes what we are to each other unless you want it to." She looked at him. She felt the tectonic movement again, the great slow shift that had begun the night he had said she was his to protect, and she thought, this is what the world feels like when you agree to trust it again. Terrifying, worth it. I love you too, she said. I have been afraid of it since spring. He let out a long, soft breath, as if something he had been holding for a very long time had been allowed to rest. That is the best thing anyone has said to me in a long time, he said. Good, she said. She pressed her thumb along the back of his hand the way she did with stones. Testing the quality, satisfied with what she found. They drove back to the homestead in the autumn dark, and when they reached the farmyard and unloaded the wagon and brought the horses in, they were different from when they had left, and the house was different when they went into it, lit by different possibilities. The autumn was a season of becoming. It was not dramatic in the way that stories sometimes pretend these things are. There were no great declarations repeated daily, no sweeping gestures. What there was, instead, was the gentle, ongoing revelation of two people who have told each other the true thing, and can now exist in that truth without armor. The way he reached past her for something on a shelf and let his hand rest on her shoulder for a moment longer than necessary, and she did not move away. The way she laughed now without any hesitation when he said something that struck her as funny, a real laugh, low and unguarded, and the way his entire face changed when he heard it. The way they sat by the fire in the evenings, and she read from the plant survey book and added her notes, and he sat with his accounts ledger or his repair work, and the silence between them was the warmest silence either of them had ever known. She kissed him first. It was early in the autumn, on the ridge above the east field, the place where they had stood together in the winter and looked at the Greymount. They went up in the evening because the autumn light on the far peaks was something specific and beautiful, a orange gold that she had described to him once, and he had wanted to see it with her. They stood on the stone shelf and watched the light change, and she turned, and he was already looking at her, as he so often was, and she put her hand against his jaw and felt the rough warmth of his beard, and she kissed him with the careful deliberateness of a woman who does nothing without meaning it. He kissed her back with everything he had, which was considerable. The first frost came in late autumn and they were ready for it. The root cellar was full, the animals secured, the north field harrowed for the winter, the medicinal stores put up and inventoried. Shagrol had already been in contact, through Merritt, with the Dunmark apothecary about a standing arrangement for the following season, a real commercial relationship, the kind that generated consistent income. The homestead hummed with the particular satisfaction of something well prepared. They sat at the table and went over the winter supply together with a kind of pleasure that was partly practical and partly something else, the pleasure of two people examining the life they are building together and finding it solid. We should expand the herb border next year, she said, running her finger down the inventory. Double the lavender, add chamomile if the soil will take it. The soil will take it, he said. The drainage in the north field lower section is good. I want to add a drying shed, she said, a proper one. What I use now is not sufficient for the volume I want to do. He looked at her. He looked at the plans she was laying out on the table, the inventory, the projections, the expansion sketches she had made in the margins of the ledger she had adopted as her own. He felt something so fierce and so full that he had to stop for a moment and just breathe with it. We will build it in the spring, he said. After the north field second pass, she said. After that, yes. She looked up at him and saw his expression, and something softened in hers. What? She said. Nothing, he said. I am just very glad. What of? She asked, though her mouth curved as if she already knew. All of it, he said. You, this. Gestured at the table, the lists, the window with the frost on its edges, the whole small, well-built world of it. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, I am going to say something, and I do not want you to make a large thing of it. All right, he said carefully. I am happy, she said. I did not think I would be again. I thought the word had stopped applying to me. She looked back down at the ledger. It was wrong of me to think that. He was quiet. He did not make a large thing of it. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her palm up and held it, and they sat like that for a while with the inventory between them and the frost on the window and the fire at their backs. Winter came again, and it was entirely different from the previous winter, in the way that the same season can be entirely different when you are not alone in it. They cooked together properly now, with her knowledge of what the plants could do to food as much as to medicine. She had a way with spices, and the foraged mushrooms she knew how to identify and preserve that changed the character of what came off the fire entirely. He made bread which she had never learned to do, and she learned it from him that winter, the patience of it, the specific requirement to attend to something slowly and let it work in its own time. She had learned, she thought sometimes, something about that from him, the specific requirement to attend to something slowly and let it work in its own time. They talked more freely now. The full range of it, the past, the future, the daily texture of things, the observations and questions and opinions that accumulate in a person and need somewhere to go. She told him about Orc clan culture with a specificity and care that surprised him, the complexity of it, the beauty of it, the parts that had served her people well and the parts that had cost them. He told her about his childhood in the eastern provinces, about his father who had believed in the value of knowing your neighbors regardless of what they looked like, about his mother who had died when he was 12, and whom he had spent a long time trying to understand as a person rather than as the absence she left. Shagrol, that winter, went with him to Crossford. It was her idea. It was also, she knew, one of the more daunting things she had proposed, given the history of Crossford and her experience of it. But she and Jeremiah had agreed that Aldous Birch and his kind had power in the valley in proportion to their opposition, and that the most effective way to diminish that power was to simply be present without apology, and to give people who were not committed to prejudice the opportunity to make different choices. Jeremiah's sister was named Ruth. She was 3 years his junior, a broad-faced woman with his same dark eyes and the frontier-toughened manner of someone who had built her own life on hard ground. She met them at her door with the expression of a woman who is facing something she has already rehearsed in her head and who is uncertain whether the rehearsal was adequate. Shagrol met her eyes directly. She did not diminish herself. She said, "You are Ruth. Your brother has spoken well of you." Ruth blinked. Then she said, with the raw honesty of someone deciding on the spot, "You had better come in." It was not warm, that first visit. Ruth was careful and measured, and her eyes returned to Shagrol often with the assessing look of someone who is revising a long-held assumption and is not entirely comfortable with the process. But she did not ask them to leave. She fed them. She asked Shagrol with the directness of a practical woman about the medicinal preparations because she had seen Merritt's yarrow and wanted to know about her goats. When they left, Ruth stood in her doorway and said to Shagrol, "Jeremiah is a good man, I hope you know it." "I know it," said Shagrol. "Then I suppose that is enough," said Ruth, and she went inside. On the road back, Jeremiah said, "That went better than I expected." "It went as I expected," said Shagrol. "She is a good person who needed a reason to reconsider." "You gave her one." "You gave her one," she corrected. "I was simply there." He shook his head, smiling. She watched him from the corner of her eye and felt something warm and entirely familiar now. They were back at the homestead before dark, and the goats needed evening care, and there was supper to consider, and the large, ordinary world of living together resumed around them, and they moved through it with the ease of long habit, except that the ease was newly built and therefore more remarkable, not less. Aldous Birch did not come back to the farm. Shagrol heard, through Merritt, who heard through the complex frontier network of information that women maintained, that Aldous had tried once to raise a formal complaint with the Dunmark magistrate about the Hayes Farms situation, and that the magistrate, who had in fact known Jeremiah Hayes for years, had told Aldous Birch in very plain language that he had no standing to bring such a complaint and ought to go home. After that, Aldous seemed to have redirected his general grievances in other directions, and the Hayes homestead was left in peace. The second spring arrived, and with it the drying shed they had planned. It went up over the course of 3 weeks in early spring, not as large as she had initially sketched, constrained by the available lumber and the time, but substantial, with good ventilation and the proper number of hanging rails and a low shelf around 3 walls for the jars. She stood inside it when it was done and looked at the space and felt the particular satisfaction of someone who has made an intention into a physical thing. "It is good," she said. "It is very good," he said behind her. She turned and found him closer than she had expected, leaning in the doorway of the shed with the afternoon light behind him, and she crossed the space between them and put her arms around him, and he held her in the doorway of the shed they had built together, and neither of them said anything for a while. The second market season at Denmark was larger than the first. She had a reputation, now word had spread through the kind of specific, human-scaled commerce that frontier communities run on, where a good yarrow preparation traveled as a recommendation from mouth to mouth, until it arrived at someone who was looking for exactly that thing. She was not welcomed universally. There were still stalls adjacent to hers whose proprietors moved through the day without acknowledging her, and customers who passed her table without stopping, based on reasons that had nothing to do with the quality of her preparations. She bore that with the steady acceptance of someone who had decided that the world's limitations were not an argument against being in the world. What was new was the repeat customers, the women who came back, asking specifically for her. The leather worker who brought his apprentice, who had burned his hands on a forge for the calendula salve. The herbalist from the Orc quarter in the south of town, an older Orc woman named Brecca, who stopped at her table at the end of the second market day and examined the preparations with the expert eye of a professional and said, "These are good work. Who taught you?" "My mother," said Shagrol. Brecca nodded. "I can see it, her preparation or yours, hers as the base, mine as the refinement." "The Valyrian is better than what I carry," Brecca said plainly. "I would like to know your method." It was the beginning of a working relationship that became, over the following months, something closer to friendship, the specific friendship of 2 Orc women who understood each other's world without needing explanation. Brecca had a shop in the Orc quarter, and a lifetime of knowledge and the pragmatic warmth of a woman who had outlasted enough difficulty to have stopped being impressed by it. She and Shagrol wrote letters through the trader network, long practical letters about plants and preparation methods and the business of making things, and sometimes at the end of the letters there were other things. "How is the farm? How is the human man?" Shagrol wrote back, "The farm is good. The human man is the reason I did not stop trusting the world." She did not intend to show him that letter, but it was on the table when he came in one morning, still unsealed, and he looked at it and then at her face and asked if he could read it. She said yes. He read it. He did not make a large thing of it. He folded it carefully and set it down and went to her and kissed her with both hands on her face, and she put her arms around his neck and held on. By autumn of the second year, the question of the future had become specific and real between them, the way it does when 2 people have been building toward it for long enough that the building itself begins to demand a name. He asked her. He did it simply, the way he did most things, without elaborate staging, sitting at the table after supper with the fire going and the autumn rain on the roof. He said, "I want to marry you if you want that." She was quiet for a long moment. "In whose tradition?" she asked. It was a practical question, but it had weight in it. "Both," he said immediately, as if he had already thought this through. "Whatever is right for you and whatever is right for me, and we put them together and make something that is ours." She looked at him across the table. Outside the rain came down on the homestead they had built together, and inside the fire was warm and the dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams and the ledger books on the shelf had both their handwriting in them, his columns and her marginal notes, inseparable. "Yes," she said, "I want that." He let out a breath and smiled, and his smile in the firelight was the most open thing she had ever seen on a human face, unguarded and entirely real. They married in the spring. It was a small ceremony, which suited both of them. Merritt came and Ruth, who had made the effort and would continue making the effort in the years that followed, driven partly by genuine affection and partly by the frontier pragmatism of a woman who respected capability wherever she found it. Brecca came from Denmark on the trader's cart and sat in the front and cried without any apparent embarrassment, which she said afterward was simply her nature at ceremonies and should not be remarked on. Jeremiah wore his best shirt, which Shagrol had mended at the collar. Shagrol wore a dress she had made herself from the dark green wool she had bought in Denmark over her leather trousers, because the dress alone was not practical, and she was not going to be impractical on her own wedding day. She wore her tusks unadorned, as herself fully. They spoke their vows twice, once in the common tongue, words they had written themselves, about the specific texture of what they had become to each other, the work and the ridge and the north field and the fire and the grief they had both carried, and the life they were choosing to carry together now. And once in Orcish, the traditional words that her mother had once told her described the bond between two people who had claimed each other, the old words that meant, "I named you mine to protect, and I am yours in the same measure, and between us there is no debt, only the choice renewed every morning." He said the Orcish words carefully, in the pronunciation she had taught him over several evenings by the fire, and he did not say them perfectly, but he said them with complete sincerity. And when he was done, Brecca made the sound that in Orc tradition means witnessing, a low, resonant affirmation, and Ruth, who did not know what it meant but felt its gravity, was quiet with it. The years that followed were the years that matter most when you are telling the story of a life, not the years of crisis and resolution, but the years of accumulation, of the slow, faithful construction of something that will outlast you. The drying shed was expanded twice. The medicinal trade became, over time, a genuine part of what the Hayes homestead was known for throughout the valley, and eventually into the wider territory Shagrol's preparations, recognizable by the specific green label she began using after Brecca suggested it, became sought after enough that she and Brecca eventually formalized a supply arrangement, the farm providing the base materials and Brecca's shop handling some of the distribution in Denmark proper. It was not a large commerce, but it was a real one, and it was entirely hers. Jeremiah broke the eastern pasture in the third year and expanded the grain operation. He hired a young man named Tossel from the valley to help with the heavy field work in the busiest seasons, a taciturn, capable young man who took Shagrol's presence on the farm as simply a fact of the place within about 2 weeks of his arrival, and thereafter worked alongside her without remark, which was, she told Jeremiah, the best you could ask. Ruth came for harvest in the 4th year and stayed 3 weeks, and by the end of it she and Shagrol had the specific rapport of two women who respected each other's competence, and had enough in common not to need to agree on everything. Ruth brought her children, a boy of 9 and a girl of 6, and the children ran around the farmyard with the absolute unself-consciousness of children who are presented with an interesting world and simply inhabit it. And the girl, who was named Nell, declared that Shagrol's tusks were the best thing she had ever seen, and could she please touch them. Shagrol, with the careful gravity of someone treating a child's request with the seriousness it deserved, bent down and allowed it. "They feel like a tooth," Nell reported. "They are a tooth," said Shagrol. "Are there two?" "Two," said Shagrol. "Can you bite things with them?" "If I need to," said Shagrol, "but it is not polite." Nell found this entirely satisfactory and went off to investigate the goats. Jeremiah, watching from the porch, was smiling the smile she had learned over years to love most, the quiet one, aimed at things he could not quite believe the goodness of. In the 5th year in midsummer, with the north field in its best season yet, and the drying shed full and the homestead at its most complete and settled version of itself, Shagrol told him she was pregnant. She told him in the morning, standing in the kitchen with the early light coming through the east window, matter of fact, because she was always matter of fact about things she was uncertain how to handle. She said them plainly and let the words do the work. He was very still for a moment, and then he crossed to her and held her face in his hands and looked at her, and she could see everything in his face. The fear, which was real and honest, because bringing a child into a world that had not yet decided what to make of their family was a thing to be afraid of, and the joy, which was larger than the fear, uncomplicated and enormous, and underneath both of those things something that she recognized as the quality of a man who has been rebuilt by love and does not take any of it for granted. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "Some," she said. "Are you?" "Some," he said. "Are you happy?" She looked at his face, this face she had been studying for 5 years, the weathered kind lines of it, the dark eyes, the particular way he held his jaw when he was feeling something very large and trying to be careful with it. "Yes," she said. "Very." He pressed his forehead against hers, and they stood like that for a while in the kitchen in the early morning light. The child was born in late winter, in the coldest part of it, with Marit as midwife and Brecca, who had come ahead of the birth and stayed, because Shagrol had asked her to, and Brecca understood what it meant to be asked. It was a long labor and a hard one, because such things tend to be, and Jeremiah stayed through all of it, which Brecca said afterward was more than many men managed and better than most. The child was a boy. He came into the world loud and insistent, which everyone agreed was fitting, given who his parents were. He had Jeremiah's dark hair and Shagrol's gray-green complexion, not as deep as hers, more of a warm sage, and his jaw already had the squared quality of her bone structure, and his eyes were the dark brown of his father's, and his ears were slightly pointed at the tips in the way of half-forked children. He was the most beautiful thing either of them had ever seen, and they said so, and it was entirely true. They named him Merrick Varg Hayes, Merrick for no specific reason other than that it sounded like itself, like something that could belong to any world. Varg for her brother, who had deserved more years and whose name deserved to be carried forward. Ruth came and held him and cried, which surprised her, and then she said, "He looks like Jeremiah around the eyes." She meant it as a thing of warmth, and it was, and Shagrol received it as such. Marit, who had delivered a great number of babies in her time on this frontier, looked at the child and said, "He is going to be very large. I can already tell." "Yes," said Shagrol, with an expression that contained both pride and the resigned foresight of a mother of an orc-descended child. "I imagined so. The valley did not transform overnight. The world is not built that way, and anyone who loves it honestly has to know that." There were people in Crossford and in the wider valley communities who remained opposed to the existence of the Hayes family, who referred to them in the language that prejudice generates when it cannot find any other argument, who sometimes made things difficult in the small ways that people can make things difficult when they are determined to. There were market days that required a thicker skin than other market days. There were moments when Shagrol, buying supplies in Denmark or driving the wagon through the valley, felt the quality of being looked at that she had felt all her life and would continue to feel, the look that evaluated her as a category rather than a person. She bore it with the steady patience that is not the same as acceptance, that is in fact its own form of refusal, the refusal to let it make her less than what she was. And she had now the particular armor of someone who has built a genuine life, which is not armor at all but substance, the kind of solidity that does not need defending because it simply exists. And there were other things. There were the farmers in the valley who came to her for the preparations, who learned her name and used it. There were the younger women in the Denmark Orc quarter who heard of her work through Brecca and came to see the farm and stayed for an afternoon and left with knowledge and the sense that there were more possibilities than they had been told. There was Nell, Ruth's daughter, who grew up knowing Shagrol as a normal part of the world and therefore made a different map of what the world contained. There was Merrick, who grew up half between two worlds and entirely his own. He was large, as Marit had predicted, and loud and curious and possessed of his mother's tracking instinct and his father's patience, which was a formidable combination. He learned to read in both Orcish script and the common tongue because both of his parents insisted on it. He learned to work the land because the land required it. He learned to make the lavender salve because he spent his childhood watching his mother make it, and simply absorbed the knowledge the way children absorb the things that surround them with love. A girl came 4 years after Merrick. They named her Clara Corva Hayes Clara for the woman Jeremiah had loved and buried, because Shagrol had suggested it, gently and sincerely, because she thought Clara deserved to be remembered forward. Corva because it was her mother's sister's name, carried from the high country, kept alive. Clara Corva had Shagrol's pale, yellow-green eyes and Jeremiah's quieter manner, and she was the kind of child who watched everything before she engaged with it, and when she engaged with it, she was entirely committed. She had small tusks that she was, by the age of 7, entirely unconcerned about, which Shagrol attributed partly to her own efforts and partly to the fact that Nell, who was 15 by then and devoted to her small half-orc cousin, had told Clara that the tusks were the finest thing she had ever seen, and Clara had believed her. The homestead grew. Tossel, the young man who had come to help with the harvest, stayed and built a small house at the Eastfield line and became, over time, something more than a hired hand, a permanent part of the working community of the place, someone who ate at the table several nights a week and knew the land as his own labor had shaped it. He was a good man, reticent and reliable, and Jeremiah trusted him with the farm when he and Shagrol went to Dunmark for market, which they continued doing twice a year. The years accumulated their weight in the good way. Shagrol's preparations had a small but real reputation through the frontier territory now. There were shops in 3 valley towns that carried the green-labeled jars, and Brecca's arrangement had expanded to include 2 younger orc women who worked the preparation alongside Shagrol during the heavy seasons. It was, she thought sometimes, looking at the drying shed full of hanging bundles and the orderly rows of jars on the shelves, her mother's knowledge made into a living thing, given form and reach and permanence in a world that had tried to take everything her mother had built. She went to the ridge above the Eastfield still. She went alone sometimes, and sometimes Jeremiah came with her, and sometimes Merrick ran up ahead of them both and stood on the stone shelf with his arms out against the wind, doing what children do on high places. She stood on the stone and looked at the Greymount, and she felt her mother there, the way you feel someone who is gone but not absent, who exists in the specific quality of what they taught you and what they made you into. On one of those mornings, Merrick was 9, Clara was 5. She and Jeremiah stood on the ridge in the early light and looked east at the mountain peaks catching the first sun, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him, into the solid, familiar warmth of him, and she thought about the night she had stood in the snow at his door, cold and injured and with nowhere to go, and bared her tusks at a lit doorway. She had meant it as a warning, aimed past him into the dark trees. Stay back. Stay out. He had understood it as a declaration. She is mine to protect. Both of those things had been true. That was what she had come to understand in the years between that moment and this one. Both of those things had been true at once, and the miracle of him was that he had held both of them without requiring her to choose. I have been thinking, she said, about what he asked, about how different it could have been, she said, if you had not opened the door. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, I was never not going to open it. You did not know that, she said, that night. No, he agreed, but it was true anyway. She looked at the mountains. The light was turning from pink to gold on the peaks, the way it did on the clear autumn mornings, and the air was cold and sharp and smelled of pine and coming frost, and Merrick was somewhere below them with the goats, and Clara was with Tossel in the south field, and the homestead sat below them in the morning light with the smoke coming from the chimney steady and real. I am glad you opened it, she said. So am I, he said. Every morning I am. She turned to look at him. This man she had come to so unwillingly and loved so completely. The gray at his temples now, the deeper lines around his eyes, the way he had grown into the kind of face that age makes more itself rather than less. He looked back at her with the full attention of someone who has been looking at the same person for 10 years and still finds more there than they can take in at once. She put her hands on his face, the large, capable hands that had bandaged wounds and grubbed stumps and made medicines and held children, and she kissed him on the ridge above the east field with the Greymont watching and the autumn light coming up around them. He kissed her back with everything, as he always had. They walked down from the ridge together as the morning fully opened, back to the homestead and the work of the day and the life they had made, the full, complicated, beautiful, ordinary, ongoing life they had made from the chance of an open door, a winter storm, a pair of tusks bared at the dark, and the simple, extraordinary fact of two people who had chosen each other when the world gave them every reason not to. The north field was in its finest season yet, the rows full and even, the herb border at its most abundant. The drying shed stood open in the morning light. The horses were already in the pasture. Below the ridge, the homestead lay in the autumn valley like something that had always belonged there, which it had, which it did, which it would for all the years that were still to come. Shagrol Darkwolf and Jeremiah Hayes walked home through the long gold light of an autumn morning, his hand in hers, and behind them the mountains kept their old bright watch, and ahead of them was everything that was still to be built and everything that had already been made whole. The story of how it had begun was the story of a door in the dark, and a storm and a woman who had nowhere left to go, and a man who had simply believed that she was his to protect. What it became was more than either of them had known to want, and real in every particular, and theirs entirely, permanently, incontestably theirs. The door had opened. Everything else had followed from that. And from where they stood now, walking down from the ridge in the morning light with their whole life warm and ongoing around them, it had always been worth opening.